So it is my absolute pleasure to begin our TED-inspired talks. We have an idea and insight with Nanette Fondas first. A scholar, activist, and mother of four, her work focuses on work and family economics. While at Oxford, she earned an MPhil in Management Studies and later a DBA at Harvard. Previously a professor of business administration, she is a contributor to many academic journals and periodicals such as The Atlantic, the Harvard Business Review, and Time. She's best known for her work advocating workplace flexibility and family-friendly organizations, which she will share a little bit more about with us today as she discusses Who Cares? Standing up for mothers and other caregivers. Please join me in welcoming Nanette Fondas.
Thank you, Ashley. When I became a mother, things changed. Perhaps that's true for you too. I had been that go-go career girl like everyone here, getting that doctorate, as Ashley mentioned, from Harvard, after the MPhil from Oxford, and trying to make a mark on the sociology of management and organizations. For 11 years, children did not figure in my work-life equation. Fast forward a mere 3 years after that, and something had changed. That subversive tick-tock of the biological clock, and I wanted that baby a lot. Blame it on the selfish gene, I suppose, which I didn't understand at the time, being overtrained in social sciences and undereducated in the natural sciences. At any rate, like many 35-year-old females, I found out that conceiving that baby wasn't quite so easy. So after lengthy infertility treatments, baby number one arrived at age 37, twins at age 41, and yes, another at 46. Anyway, is it politically incorrect, probably, to say that my productivity was impeded by all that? I was an assistant professor on track to earn tenure at a U.S. research university, but taking care of babies takes time. The university had one solution, stop the tenure clock for 1 year, but what I observed was that some of my male colleagues took the extra year too, even when they had minimal or no child care responsibilities because they had a stay-at-home wife. Hence, an unintended consequence of such tenure clock extensions was to raise the bar for mothers seeking tenure. Caring for children undoubtedly complicates careers, as we've been hearing over the last 2 days, and so too does navigating dual careers when you have a spouse or partner. My Pluto-studying astrophysicist friend calls this the two-body problem. She says one planet gets a job or promotion that leads to relocating to a new orbit, which then pulls the second planet to a new city, state, or, for this group, different countries. These tugs between caring roles and career have been chronicled by many writers who I adore. Some of my favorites are Anne Crittenden's The Price of Motherhood, Caitlin Flanagan's To Hell with All That, and recently, Katrine Marsal's new book, Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner? Yeah. It wasn't his wife, by the way, it was his mother. Anne-Marie Slaughter's article in The Atlantic went viral, no doubt, because most of us experience work-family conflict sooner or later. And early on, there was our own Naomi Wolf in Misconceptions, describing that what she wanted when she became a mother was a revolution in gender roles. What she got was sharing the caregiving with a professional woman caregiver. I wanted a revolution too, a way to keep mothers' voices in the world without a total sacrifice of caring for our children. I wanted to be with those babies, and I wanted to be a badass professor too. Naive, impossible, maybe. But I started to think about how to find solutions for all moms. I thought Rhodes Women might be interested in this and well-positioned to spearhead a mother's movement. So I wrote a piece in 2005 for the American Oxonian called Mothers, Rhodes Scholars, and the World's Fight, a Call to Action. I hoped it would prompt some organizing at an upcoming reunion, because surely I couldn't be the only one that was experiencing this difficulty of career and raising children. It turns out that it was published after the reunion, and Anyway, I realized that Rhodes women seem to be immersed in their own professional niches anyway, not necessarily inclined or able to dedicate much time to activism on this topic, at least. So I kept reading, and one day an email arrived in my inbox from just a friend, and she said that a group called Moms Rising was forming in the US. My friends had been urging me for years, I mean, probably maybe for a decade, to found a mother's advocacy organization, and they even had a name for it. It was Nanette's List, because that was the early days of Craigslist and Emily's List. But anyway, when I mentioned the email to my husband, who is a business strategy expert, he sagely advised, first mover advantage. You can't beat them, so join them. So I did. For Moms Rising, I worked on flexible work arrangements, since flexibility is a key to integrating work and caregiving. I wrote a book with co-founder Joan Blades, offering other solutions such as virtual working, on-ramping after time away from the paid labor force, bringing children to the workplace, especially to what they call a results-only work environment. But something gnawed at me. I felt we needed something different, not just 12 weeks or even 12 months of paid parental leave, as other countries have, but rather a larger appreciation and valuation of the work, of decades of investment involved in caring for family members. Certainly, advocates and organizations exist to press the case for valuing care work, such as Save the Children's reports on the state of the world's mothers, caring across generations, the caring economy, there are others as well. But is this enough? I still feel, as I did in 2005, that Rhodes Scholars could make a difference, that we could stand up more for mothers and other caregivers. Let's think about it. Okay, how many of you are mothers? Oh, wow, very good. How many of you might become a mother? Just a few more. Okay. How many of you have a mother? Okay. All right, how many of you are old? Yeah. Oh, no. How many of you might get old? All right, and how many of you might need care from someone else when you're old? Right. And give care. Standing up for the world, fighting the world's fight, it's really impossible without the work of caregiving in families. And we know from our personal lives and from research that women still shoulder the lion's share of responsibility, even when working full-time. It varies somewhat, but worldwide, women spend an average of 4.5 hours a day on unpaid work, caring for children and other family responsibilities. Men spend about half of that, according to recent OECD data. Relative to women, Scandinavian men spend the most time on domestic tasks, and men in India, Mexico, Turkey, and Japan spend the least. In Norway, for instance, women spend about 3.5 hours a day on unpaid work, while men spend almost 3 hours. In India, women spend 6 hours, and men spend less than 1 hour. Yeah. I knew you knew. And in the UK, New Zealand, and France, and Australia, women do about 2 hours a day more than men, and with the US women working about 1.5 hours longer. Now, economists estimate that women around the world work 39 days more than men each year, caring for children, the ill, the elderly. ActionAid found that the additional hours and days of unpaid care work spread out over the average life expectancy for women globally amounts to a staggering 23 years of work. Furthermore, it's usually women who reduce their hours of paid work to take care of the unpaid caregiving work at home. OECD, again, reports that worldwide, compared to men, women are less likely to work full-time, more likely to be employed in lower paid occupations, less likely to progress in their careers, and as a result lose income, pension contributions, future earnings, and are more likely to end their lives in poverty. A recent report on the state of elder caregiving in US families found the overwhelming percentage of caregivers are women, and 91% of them are daughters. A full 42% said that their professional careers had suffered as the result of their caregiving. So it's a double whammy. Women scale back or quit their paid jobs more than men do for caregiving, and women do more of the unpaid caring work at home. Would people care more about all this care work if they knew what it's worth? OECD finds that across the board, unpaid work represents a notable percentage of every nation's GDP. Estimates vary depending on how you measure it, but it ranges from 15% of GDP for Canada, 32% for Hungary, 43% for Portugal, to about 50% for the US, UK, and Australia. McKinsey Global Institute found that if all unpaid work were, quote, compensated at a rate approximating minimum wage, 10 trillion would be added to global economic output, or 13% to global GDP. Unpaid care work, by which human capital is created and enriched, is the work that makes capitalism possible. It's an investment in others. Yet, it is also what makes women disproportionately poor, lagging in leadership and representation, and segregated into lower-paying job sectors. Women's quest for equality will never be achieved until this traditional work receives its full worth and consideration in public policy and in all private and public institutions. So many of us, Rhodes sisters, have or will soon manage to successfully compete in the world of men. In addition to your professional achievements, remember, it's just as important to value the work of care and unpaid domestic labor. Acknowledge that care work enables all other work to get done. Insist on respect for that in the circles that you orbit. There may be other things you can do too in your own capacities as leaders and influencers. For example, don't discriminate against those whose careers have taken a different course because of caregiving. Take a chance on second chances. Hire that mother when she's ready to re-enter the workforce. Initiate and support university programs to relaunch people into their former careers or enter new ones altogether after caregiving abates. People are living longer, consider that. Does your company offer childcare or emergency backup care programs? Do you have flexible work options and paid family leave? US government folks, let's talk about how to add caregiver credits to the Social Security system, as France, Germany, and Sweden do. Let's get creative. How about child rearing as a precursor to a career, like universal service or the draft for both sexes, as Judith Shulevitz argued recently in the New York Times? Support caregivers by advocating for minimum wage laws and fair wages for domestic workers generally, and all educators too. Who cares? I care, even though my kids are almost grown up. Some scholars care. Economists should care, as should business and public policy leaders, for the economy does rely on the invisible helping hands of caregivers. A vital question is, do you care too? Thanks. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. So there's two scholars with microphones. Does anyone have any questions for Nanette? Good.
You're going to get a one-sentence comment. The person responsible for my brother's belonging to the shameful Indian statistic is our dear mother.
A second question?
Or comment?
If you don't have children, don't think you're escaping, because being a carer for your parents is going to come up and bite you just at the time when you think you're safe. If you do have kids, you will become part of the sandwich generation, caring for both the young and the old. So it's really, really important to create that space for yourself.
Thank you.
All right. Do any current scholars have questions?
Very current. I'm transitioning from not being current. But I think there's something to be said in taking pleasure of it. At some point, there's a big fight for getting our space and all that. But I have an 8-month-old, and I have never, ever, ever felt anything like it. So even as we find our spaces, please let's make time to just appreciate how beautiful it is to watch somebody depend on you and love you in a way that you could never, ever possibly be loved.
Great. Thank you, Nanette. Let's give her another round of applause. So next, it's my pleasure to welcome Rhodes Professor of Law of the British Commonwealth in the USA at the University of Oxford. Sandra Fredman also serves as the founder and director of the Oxford Human Rights Hub. An active writer and academic contributor, she's widely published in the fields of gender equality, labor law, and human rights. She has served as an advisor on equality for the UK, Northern Ireland, Canada, the ILO, the UN Women, the World Bank, the EU Commission, and the UN Working Group on non-discrimination against women in social and economic life, to name just a few of the organizations and governments that she has worked with. Today, she will discuss educating for empowerment. Please join me in welcoming Sandra Fredman.
Hello, and thanks very much. So if you had a toilet like this at your school, what would you do? Would you even bother to go to school? The girls at the school where I took this photograph, which is in the Eastern Cape in South Africa, were much more committed than that. They walked a long way to get to school. They went to the toilet in the bush. And this was not the worst toilet we saw. Many schools didn't have toilets at all. And so, not surprisingly, the fields around them were littered with feces and sanitary towels and toilet paper. One of the girls that I spoke to, who was called Vusi, told me that she went to school even when she was on her period. But that was only as long as she had sanitary towels, and often she didn't have any. Then she stayed away. She told me that when she went to the toilet in the bush, it wasn't so much the snakes and the spiders that worried her. It was the men who were drinking beer at a nearby shebeen in the backyard of someone's house. She told me it's very hard to learn in these circumstances. So my question today is, how can we use human rights to achieve education? And conversely, how can we educate to achieve human rights? We've had lots of promises. In 2000, the world committed itself to the Millennium Development Goals. The promise was that by 2015, there would be universal enrollment in primary school for all girls and boys. We didn't get there. We only got 90% there. That means that we still have 1 in 10 children, which is 57 million primary school children age out of school, and the majority of these are girls. Many of these will never see a classroom. More than 4 in 10 out-of-school children will never go to school, and the majority of these are girls. Even if they do enroll, they often drop out, and even if they do go through school, they often come out with a poor quality education, sometimes not even literate. In 2015, under the Sustainable Development Goals, the world committed itself to even more ambitious targets. Under Goal 4, we have all promised to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education for everyone. We've also promised to achieve gender equality and to empower all women and girls. We only have 15 years to do this, which is a short time. We need to get a move on. And this is where human rights can really have traction. Human rights are not handouts or charity. They are rights, which each individual should claim. Human rights aren't promises which governments can change their mind on. They are binding, legally enforceable duties. It's not enough under a human rights approach to say we've achieved 90%. If there are 57 million children out of school, that means 57 million rights are breached. And this is where human rights can really help. When I took this picture, which is of a school in the Eastern Cape in South Africa, that's a classroom, I was helping the Legal Resources Centre, which is a foremost public interest law firm in South Africa, to build a case that the right to education includes the right to decent toilets. But the Legal Resources Centre has been very successful in litigating through the courts to say that a right to education should include a right to a school class, to school buildings, to desks and chairs, to textbooks, even to teachers. And litigators in many states in the US have now argued that the right to education includes the right to adequate funding in inner city disadvantaged areas in many of the states. In Colombia, the court held that there's a right to free compulsory education. And in Brazil, the court has held it even extends to preschool education. So what can we as Rhodes Women do to contribute to a human rights approach to achieving education? And what can we do, conversely, to educate for human rights? Well, we've been very privileged in our own education as Rhodes Scholars and throughout our lives. But we haven't always had this. When I came all those many years ago as a Rhodes Scholar to Oxford, I was only in the third year that they had women as Rhodes Scholars. It was only the first year that all colleges were co-educational. So as you can imagine, it was a very male-dominated environment. In my first tutorial in politics, my politics tutor spent the whole tutorial talking to my male tutorial partner, even when I asked the questions. And in my economics tutorial, my economics tutor spent the whole time flirting with the young French woman who was my tutorial partner. So in a rush of blood to the head, I changed to law, which wasn't very logical. But it was actually has stood me in good stead, in that law, and particularly human rights law, can be a powerful weapon in achieving change, in achieving education in particular for many. So in my career, I've tried to use human rights law, particularly in the fields of women's empowerment, women in the labor force, women at home, women in education. I've tried to make an academic contribution, but it's always been very important that that academic contribution can have traction with policy. So I've worked closely with various policymakers. My work on substantive equality was fed into the Equality Act 2010 in the UK and the progress of the World's Women Report for UN Women. I've worked with the ILO in South Africa on equal pay legislation, and most recently, although it's not easy work, to work with the UK government on protecting equality law after Brexit. But my main mission was to be an educator, and I've been enormously fortunate in seeing generations of young students, both graduates and undergraduates, who are able to go away with a greater understanding of human rights. And amongst them, very centrally, have been my Rhodes Women. So all of these are Rhodes Women scholars who I've been privileged to work with over the time. These are actually over the last 5 or 10 years. Some of them are here in the audience. You can see that they come from lots of different places in the world. Australia, India, Kenya, South Africa, US. And they have been a source of enormous inspiration. With their energy, their intelligence and commitment, we've always felt that we've only got to imagine things and then we can do them. And so when I became the Rhodes Chair in 2012, I had a vision. The vision was to create a global human rights community with the students at the magnetic center and with our spokes radiating outwards and inwards through the ether. The vision was to create the Oxford Human Rights Hub. Through the magic of technology, we could together improve the practice and share best practice in human rights. And through educating each other about how we achieve human rights, we could immeasurably improve human rights everywhere. 5 years on our 5th anniversary, we are now a global presence. In order to share best practice in human rights, every day we run a short analysis of a cutting-edge human rights law development from somewhere in the world, written by an expert in that part of the world. And you can see from this map that we've had over 400 different contributors from 40 different countries. Each analysis is edited to a very high level by our student editors under my supervision, and each of them is only 700 words, which we all know is very difficult to achieve. But that means that they are very pithy, easy to read, and accessible to everyone. We're a very democratic space. We run contributions from senior professors, lawyers, UN special rapporteurs, together with contributions from students, early career academics, and young lawyers. And we've had an important impact. When the Verma Commission was established in India after the horrendous rape of a young woman in Delhi to consider crimes, gender violence crimes, we were asked to make a submission, and the submission was included almost verbatim in the report. More recently, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education asked us to convene an online forum on privatization in education, and the resulting report was included in his report to the United Nations. We also have had a physical presence. We run conferences in lots of different places. We've been in Rwanda, in Brazil, in the UK, and in India. And that's been very important in bringing together both senior and junior human rights activists and academics. We also find it very important, and this is where the energy of the students and the graduates come in, to continue to innovate on methods of communication. Most recently, our postgraduates, led by Kira, who's sitting here, have set up a series of podcasts interviewing well-known human rights experts from all over the world. So when many of us are washing the dishes or in the gym, you can listen to as well as read about human rights. But the right to education remains pivotal. So our most recent project is to create a documentary where we share best practice on public interest litigation on the right to education. We've interviewed litigators from 4 different countries. One of them is Lisa Drager from Equal Education in South Africa. You can see her there in Khayelitsha. And as she puts it, public interest litigation is the one space within the law in which you can shape the law to ensure that justice is ultimately done. Our documentary, which is called Learning to Litigate, will be launched next month. And our hope is that many others like Vusi can be empowered to claim their human rights to a decent education. So our great mission is to create resources of a very high quality, free online. But the students remain at the center. It's through their energy and their inspiration, their great commitment, that we continue to expand the boundaries. When they leave Oxford, they don't leave the Oxford Human Rights Hub. They remain part of our global community. And the Rhodes Women have been central to this. So together, our mission is to continue to educate for empowerment. Through using human rights, we can achieve decent education for everyone. And through education, we can improve human rights. Thank you.
Great. Any questions?
Hello, Aliyah Ahad from Bermuda 2014. I have a question. You talked about the Sustainable Development Goals, and I know the upcoming Global Compact on Migration, which is something that's very important to me, is also in the works at the UN level. And I'm wondering, because a lot of time is spent in the negotiation phase, but not a lot of time is spent thinking about implementation and where the finances are going to come from. I was wondering if you could maybe touch on what you think could remedy that situation.
Did you say on the development goals? Yeah, sorry, I missed the beginning. Well, absolutely. I think we've all made huge promises which are enormously ambitious, but nobody is really putting the effort in, or not enough effort is being put to advance that. And that is what we as Rhodes Women could contribute. And that is what we are doing as well, what I'm trying to do through the Oxford Human Rights Hub, which is to continue to work on finding ways in which we can make these promises come true. Obviously, my specialty is through human rights, and I think we can use legally binding mechanisms in lots of different ways, not just through courts, but through advocacy, through community organization, through empowerment, but not to take our eye off the target so that we don't reach 2030 and find, well, what have we done?
Any other questions? I think I saw one right here.
Arushi, Indian model in 2013. Thank you so much for your talk, Sandy. So a lot of emphasis in your presentation was on litigating for education through empowerment, and the specific tool of public interest litigation, which might be for unique reasons, but in India, it's come under some criticism for collapsing the institutional role of courts, which should be to enforce and not create the law in a way. So I was just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Arushi, and thanks for raising that. Well, I think ultimately our ideal would be that we would use political avenues and the democratic arena. But the truth is that the political avenues often fail us. And if political avenues had worked, we would already have a much better situation on education for the poorest people in the world. So it seems to me we need to use whatever avenues are available. It's not always the case that courts will be receptive in the right kind of ways. And it's true that there are risks around courts, that courts might take too much power, or they might even ignore the realities. But I think as litigators, there is a lot of power in how you shape the approach to the courts. It's possible to make it more democratic by including many different civil society groups, voices, stakeholders. And it's not always successful, but it's certainly worth trying to make sure that the courts deal with these issues in a democratic way and not in a very top-down elite way. So it's not to say it's the ideal solution, but we have to be pragmatic and we have to use whatever is available and shape it in the way we can.
Let's give another round of applause for Dr. Fredman. Thank you. So next up we have Dr. Anne Olivarius. She has opted to talk for 20 minutes, cutting out the Q&A to take it over lunch. So focusing on women's rights, Dr. Ann Olivarius has managed complex legal matters for over 25 years, from Alexander versus Yale and the legal definition of sexual harassment to the criminalization of revenge porn in the US and the UK. Ann has been a pivotal force. Nelson Mandela has described her as a lawyer who has advised me well. The chair of the Rhodes Project, today she will discuss what Rhodes women want. Please join me in welcoming Ann.
I don't mean to block questions afterwards, but I'm today for the first time going to discuss this study that we started over a decade ago. We've been collecting data from Rhodes women in different ways and forms, and so this is the first time in a fairly serious way that I'm going to discuss some of the findings. So that's why we're going to go a little bit longer, because there's a lot of findings. All right. How does this? So 40 years, over 1,000 women scholars. We're no longer the disturbing, pushy anomalies that many considered us to be at the outset. But look around this room. All of you today make for a breathtaking list of power and achievement. I think all of us knew when we showed up at Oxford that our male predecessors, with their 80-year head start, had made the scholarship something important and left us big shoes to fill. The men who came before us are a storied club. About this, there is no doubt. But what I'd like to talk about today is, what is our legacy? What is the contribution, the legacy of Rhodes women? Who are we? What has been our story? What have we wanted from our lives? What do we still want? And how can we not just fill the shoes left by our male predecessors, but shape a new set of shoes that are fully our own and that might be better than what has come before? Let me start with some results from the investigations of Rhodes women that we've been running since 2004 through the Rhodes Project, using survey and interview data that many of you in this room have been good enough to provide. First off, we have learned that most of us are fairly affluent, but we don't define ourselves or measure our accomplishments by money. When we sent out questionnaires asking, how much do you earn? Fill in a block, 50 to 100,000, 100,000 to 150. So many women wrote back, they hit their box, and then they said, and on my last return, it was actually 157,000 pounds and 20, exactly. So we're precise about money. We don't define ourselves about money, and we're willing to talk about it in ways that perhaps are not typical to many men. There are many more salary earners and entrepreneurs in our group, though this is changing slightly with the younger generation of Rhodes women. Many of us are academics. The list of our prizes, books, endowed chairs, deanships, and senior positions in the academy is really quite vast. We are clearly good at thought leadership to start with, and the life of the mind is a very big draw. I can think of no scholarly discipline or body of knowledge which we have not expanded, deepened, and pioneered. The level of honesty in our answers to my research team surveys and interviews is striking, showing keen self-awareness amongst us and a strong desire to live ethically. And just because we're not easy to pigeonhole, I think it's interesting to note as a point of contrast that many of us have considered, are planning to have, or have already had plastic surgery. So we are women of a certain culture and time also. Okay, our findings. Let me go back here. Yeah, okay, let's see. All right, our findings. That's what happens. So throughout the constituency countries supporting Rhodes scholarships, 98% of female Rhodes scholars have identified themselves as politically liberal in their countries, in their places. And most of us worldwide identify ourselves as feminists, and on our questionnaires, most women wrote back saying feminist, exclamation point, or resoundingly, enthusiastically. We had very strong feelings about that. But many scholars also they've reported terminating pregnancies overwhelmingly and without guilt or fear, and being actually content afterwards, glad that they had done that, not reviewing their decision and saying, I wish I hadn't. They report having affairs, as we do in the rest of the world, and also being victims of violence and sexual assault. We're both a talented group, but also one not immune to many of the same experiences of women everywhere. The Rhodes Scholarship has not given us a free pass on gender violence, and many have told us, because sexual violence is also, when you have a small group, it feels like many because it's such a terrible thing. But a number of you have told us that you have been raped, but we've learned that Rhodes women tend not to report their rapes to police. They keep them private in their worlds, as many women apparently do. Our younger scholars report they have engaged in sex that they don't find particularly pleasurable to make their male partners happy. Young lesbian Rhodes scholars report similar experiences with their partners. Now, you had a preview of this, but where several male Rhodes scholars have lost their bar licenses and have been convicted of financial and other crimes. We're not aware, and maybe Charles Kahn is going to correct me here, but we're not aware. Thank you. He can't correct me. We're not aware that any female Rhodes scholar has had any of these problems or similar problems. Indeed, we tend to be an altruistic group, caring more about giving back to others than aggrandizing ourselves. In our relationships, our personal relationships, we prefer peers, not trophy spouses. We seek equals. Many of us over 35 have children. In fact, that's the norm. Most of us carry the primary responsibility for our children and for our homes, pets, and elderly family members. Until we had children, most of us split domestic duties fairly equally with our partners. After children, we've taken on the lion's share of child and home care responsibilities, either by doing that work ourselves, which, to be fair, is not very common, or by hiring others, usually women, to do that work, which is indeed very common. Regardless of our age, most of us report that we have experienced sex harassment and gender discrimination inside and outside of the workforce. We observe that our voices don't get as easily heard as do our male colleagues' voices. We asked women Rhodes scholars what motivated their careers. Almost uniformly, they responded that they wanted to make the world a better place. And many used the definitional phrase, to fight the world's fight. We understand this fight as a call to moral purpose, to help others to do good. As an aside, I note that when we asked the class of '78, my year, of men what motivated their careers, not one of the respondents mentioned fighting the world's fight. Now, one of the reasons I was interested in the story of Rhodes women was Philip Ziegler's official history of Rhodes scholarships called Legacy. Ziegler's book dealt with many controversial and difficult aspects of Cecil Rhodes' legacy, and he did this with great balance, I would say, and quite a bit of wisdom. But despite being published 30 years after women were admitted, so 10 years ago from today, the book mentioned female Rhodes scholars just once, and only in the context of posing a question about whether the advent of women to the scholarship has reduced the incidence of worldly success. Ziegler believed that although the female Rhodes scholars performed as well or better than their male peers at Oxford, for some reason they failed to build upon this foundation later in life, noting that driving ambition is far from being a uniquely masculine attribute, but it does not so often appear to be dominant in the female. Essentially, to be clear, Mr. Ziegler contends that all of us here today, individually and collectively, amount to less than our Rhodes male scholar colleagues. Now, I was born in Brooklyn, the oldest of 5 girls in a scrappy Catholic family. I was expected to marry my high school sweetheart and have his babies, and I was told by my high school guidance department that my ambition to go to a school like Yale was impossible. They wouldn't even process my application materials through them. I did go to Yale, but not with their help or emotional support, which is so important. And so I confess, when I read Ziegler's words, they really got under my skin. One more time, it seemed, we as women were being told we weren't good enough as an excuse for not belonging to the club. How was he measuring success? Who were his models? Surely he didn't expect us to produce as many generals, presidents, and senators in 30 years that male Rhodes Scholars had produced in 100. What were his criteria? When I met him, he told me he had reached out to me because I had a distinguished reputation as an employment lawyer working mainly for women. He was quite kind and generous, and he seemed to be listening quite intently. But afterwards, when I saw the notes from that meeting, the things that I would consider perhaps somewhat noteworthy, that he might be interested in knowing and are maybe good things that Rhodes Scholars are doing. Things like he didn't pay attention to the fact that I coined the term date rape. He didn't think that being an architect for sexual harassment law around the world was anything worth mentioning. He didn't know that I was a leader, even then, in global philanthropy for legal global philanthropy. That I had advised Queen Rania on rewriting the Jordanian constitution to protect women. That I advised the Mexican government on NAFTA and what it might want to get from the United States in order to aid its country and be fair in the negotiations. And he didn't at all seem to care that Nelson Mandela was one of my clients, and that at least, he felt that I had really done a lot to make the world better for hundreds of millions of people, according to Mandela. Somehow, none of that was worthy enough, but I was a good lawyer, I guess. That's what he saw me as. So in short, Mr. Ziegler seemed well informed about the male recipients of the scholarship, of which he spoke a lot about those very good men with me over our lunch together, but not so much about the women. And yet, despite his limited knowledge of an effort to learn about us, Ziegler nonetheless pronounces in his book, his very weighty and good book, that our achievements are not good enough. Of course, there are different types of success in the world. So the question that interested me in the wake of Ziegler's grim assessment of us was, are Rhodes women genuinely not as successful in worldly terms as our men? Or are we succeeding but in ways men perhaps don't yet fully recognize? I must say it would be hard not to recognize the classic forms of success filling these halls this weekend. You are a veritable roster of global leaders. It's hard to look around this room and contend we don't exhibit markers of traditional success. As one Rhodes Scholar put it, we are living big, expansive lives, and often on the world stage. For a lot of people, including a lot of women, the movement for women's equality exists largely in the past. But I say to you today, they're wrong about that. It continues today, and all of us in this room are a part of it, men and women alike. This movement is as urgent and as vital as it ever was. Perhaps one of the differences between how men and women scholars have fared is that the playing field is never quite level. I think back to my own first Rhodes interview in 1977, the first year women could apply. I applied in my home state of New Jersey and didn't get it. And afterwards, the chair of the selection committee, Malcolm Forbes Sr., came out and asked me if I minded whether I had not won. I did mind. I did very much, and I told him so. And I said, and I might apply next year. He said, oh, don't worry about that so much. I should refocus my priorities because he said, and I quote this, you could make some man senator someday. I gave him the only possible reply that I could under the circumstances, although actually it wasn't true, but sometimes you have to say the right thing at the right time, so I tried. And I said, Mr. Forbes, I want to be senator someday. And he said, and I quote, he said, damn it, that's just what we didn't get about you. Now, the world may have changed and the discrimination that we experienced may not be as blatant as that, but I note that more than half of our respondents, including younger scholars, report experiencing discrimination or outright harassment against women at Oxford, here, and half said it was worse at Oxford than at their undergraduate university. My own DPhil supervisor told me which chapters of his book I was expected to write that would be cobbled together into my own thesis. and invited me to spend the weekend with him on our second meeting. It caused an almighty ruckus here at Rhodes House for me to get a new supervisor, which I was told was my own fault. I'm sad to say that my legal practice gets regular inquiries here in London from women at Oxford with similar stories today. And despite real and important progress in the last 40 years, I don't think many of us would contend that we have reached the nirvana of equal opportunity. The evidence for this is so obvious, I won't belabor it. 64% of Rhodes women respondents believe they had missed out on an opportunity for a pay rise, a promotion, or a key assignment because they are female. A recent Rhodes Project survey asked you what, if anything, you would change to level the playing field for women. Overwhelming, through all years of women, all decades of women, there were 3 things that came out resoundingly that you told us that would make a difference to all of our lives. We had almost unanimity on this. The first was we have to address, of course, the unequal responsibility for children, which has already been addressed here today. Surprisingly to me, women said jealousy and how it is directed against us must be now made visible and discussed. And then the third rallying cry was around the persistence of unequal pay for equal work. I'm going to go through these fairly briefly. Whoops. Okay, so those are the 3. You might think that the division of domestic labor would be relatively equal for Rhodes Scholar women, given their generally substantial earnings and ambition. Well, it wasn't that way in my own life. My husband, Jeff McAllister, is enlightened by the standards of many men, a sincere feminist, but in theory more than practice. His work as a journalist routinely took precedence over the demands of our home life, leaving me to pick up the slack, irrespective of my own work pressures. Data from the Rhodes Project shows that this is, in fact, a common story. In marrying fellow Rhodes Scholars, or in my case, a Marshall Scholar, we Rhodes women adhered to the socialization that told us that female success looks like male success, plus being effective in our traditional gender role assignments. If we wanted to be senator someday, we didn't want to give up the traditional definitions of being good wives, partners, and mothers. In responding to the Rhodes Project's most recent questionnaire, almost 1/2 of you believe that an important thing would be an improvement to childcare offerings, the creation of mandatory paternity leave, and establishing equality at home, that this would create the most important chances to improving a woman's life and to advancing all of us at work. One female Rhodes Scholar wrote, "We must change the expectation or adjust the tendency that caring for dependents falls to women." Another wrote, and 1/3 of women scholars believe that taking maternity leave hurt them at work, even in jobs where they loved and were good at, where they were highly regarded. It made no difference. One scholar says, "I had a senior job offer rescinded when I told the company that I was expecting my first child." 81% of all respondents believe that having children limited career responsibilities and opportunities. One said flatly, "Mother destroyed her career." She quoted Adrienne Rich, "Female possibility has been literally massacred on the site of motherhood." Our research reveals no trend of Rhodes Scholar women seeking out partners who will stay home, raise the kids, cook our meals, and clean the house. A Rhodes Scholar who recently decided to leave the practice of law was prompted to do so because she felt seriously out of place. Oh, having a hard time here. All of the secretaries, legal assistants, and paralegals were women in her law firm. Many of the male partners had full-time housewives, enabling them to work the legendary hours they in turn require of young lawyers. None of the female partners had a full-time, stay-at-home spouse. The firm offered a part-time and flexi option. Some, a very small number of mothers, took them, but literally no fathers ever took them. Another Rhodes Scholar, when asked what she wanted out of life, responded by telling us what she wanted for her children. These are her words: "To be major actors in their field, to have great love affairs, to live intensely, all things that she felt she had not been able to do." She explained that she had spent a long time looking to marry Mr. Good Enough, but had failed. She was overwhelmed with her need for perfection, to be excellent as a parent and a professional, while staying thin, healthy, fit, and well-dressed. She felt that she was failing at everything. Women scholars who are in same-sex arrangements appear to negotiate home, child, and elder management much more effectively than Rhodes heterosexual couples do, and we are assuming that that's because straight couples are more influenced by standard gender norms. Jealousy, what a hard topic, and one we're not used to discussing really amongst ourselves, I think. From our research, we have found another constraint on our achievements, the paradoxical finding that women are often jealous of other women when they achieve success because, unlike men, we do not feel that they're entitled to it. The scarcity of female leadership adds to this by making us compete covertly against our female colleagues for what we think is actually a limited number of female slots. I experienced this in my own life when I was running the Sarnoff Endowment, a medical research foundation. I hired a female part-time lawyer, Karen Savransky, to help with some of the legal work of running the foundation, while I led a major litigation on behalf of the endowment. On the other side of the table to me were the legal heavyweights, Marty Lipton and Bernie Nussbaum. Bernie, who went on to become White House counsel for Bill Clinton. She decided for some reason that my salary was too high, my children too perfect, or something to that effect. It was never clear, and got me fired by accusing me, quite extraordinarily, of expense account fraud, an allegation that was thoroughly false and decisively disproven, but only after a long fight when I wondered if I would ever be employed again. A consultant working on the case concluded that Savransky was obsessed with me. Why? But she was obsessed with me, and she had changed her clothing and her hairstyle to be like mine. And her attacks on me, irrational as they were, continued over decades. This wasn't just a flash in the pan. Now, in my law practice, I tell you this story because in my law practice, I've had many cases where women have been terminated because of envy from other women that was played out in often Baroque plots. I've had Rhodes Scholar clients, and quite a few of them, whose professional lives have been seriously harmed, including some being triggered into multi-year dark depressions because those who made decisions about their careers were propelled by jealousy. Please do not mistake my point. I do not mean to blame other women for our problems. Indeed, I have fought my entire career for female justice and equality. And in most instances, the cause of the problem is not women. It is indeed men. Nonetheless, our own research also backs up the idea that women too frequently subvert the achievements of other women. Another big impediment that we face is unequal pay. This is absolutely a global problem and includes women at the top tier. Men make more money for the same work in nearly every profession and across all age ranges. This was made starkly clear by the release just a few months ago of salary data from the BBC, a relatively progressive organization funded mainly with government money. Men were the top 7 earners, and women were only 1/3 of the top 96 earners. Google, sexy Google, right? Google that many of us want to work for. According to pay information collected by one of its employees, pays women less than men at all levels, and the gap widens as women become more senior. Women across all sectors, whenever pay data is begrudgingly revealed through lawsuits generally, we have learned that women are almost always paid less than men for comparable roles. Female Rhodes Scholars are not immune. Although many of us have reached senior positions, including in the C-suites, our surveys show that many of us are convinced that we are doing the same work as men who benefit from more senior titles and better pay. Even now, our respondents note that we are sometimes still the only woman in a room of men. Well, in my experience, it doesn't mean that there's something special about you if you're in that room. It means that there's something wrong with the room. Only 1/4 of female Rhodes Scholars in our research believe that we are and have scripted our own lives. So what's next? How can we make things better for our successors and for all women and men in the next 40 years and beyond, so that men and women equally can script their own lives? We must start from where we are. When the Rhodes Project asked women scholars to describe themselves, the top descriptors were, in this order, we're energetic, focused, leader, very busy, and mothers. That's how we see ourselves. Another important finding is that the female scholars have a very high, though, sense of duty to others. We believe strongly in striving to help others and indeed to put them first. On the one hand, this can be viewed, as Ziegler appears to, as a lack of ambition. But in another way, this is just another way of expressing a desire to fight the world's fight, to accomplish things for a larger purpose. Our ambition isn't for ourselves, sometimes, but not just for ourselves. The others we put first aren't just our partners and children, but people who do not enjoy our advantages. We see a significant portion of Rhodes women working in social justice, seeking to protect the vulnerable. And a very high percentage of our corporate lawyers and bankers are extraordinarily active in civic and charitable life and report satisfaction in that work. So this, as much as any successes measured by stock options and estates and yachts and sartorial splendor, is worthy of acknowledgement and indeed celebration. The paradigm for Rhodes scholars who devote their careers to helping others has been through high public office. Despite some notable female examples, here are the most famous figures, definitely skew male. Almost 13% of Rhodes women have been appointed to political or judicial office, but only 5% of Rhodes women have run for political office. And almost a half of you indicate you would consider doing so, but very few of us actually take the steps necessary to appear on the ballot. One of our women says, I originally thought I would enter electoral politics as a path to the good fight, but family responsibilities and profound resistance of my ex-husband, as well as growing dismay, disillusion, and disgust with elected politicians steered me away from that course. Now I do as much pro bono work as possible. But isn't this exactly the type of person, the type of woman we need to encourage to stand for office? Of course, our hesitation is understandable. You only have to see the social media onslaught that now greets women who state firm opinions on almost any topic, how we are trolled, doxxed, and routinely threatened over the internet, or even recall the mauling, I think is a fair word, that Hillary Clinton took last year for being an alleged murderer, thief, operator of a pedophile ring. Really? To feel that the deterrents to plunging into the political arena for women are getting higher. So solutions. These are the solutions that you have suggested. Given the state of politics today, I can only hope that more of us take the risk of putting ourselves in the public eye. We need to do so for ourselves, for our daughters, and for our sons. Beyond this, I'm reluctant to offer too much by way of prescription for what we should do. We're told we need to lean in, dress for success, dare greatly, break all the rules, among other prescriptions for accomplishment and happiness. The Rhodes Project data doesn't give me any precise answer for how we achieve the good life or a life of doing good. But in general, I would say that based on our research, two things are needed most. First, we need to expand the conventional definition of notable achievement to be fully inclusive of work and home accomplishments. The personal must be evaluated and respected with the professional. Both are vital to leading successful lives and to fighting the good fight in positively impactful ways. And second, we need to promote public discussion, legislation, and education on the issues that most concern us, that most affect our lives. Specifically, according to you, childcare must not remain the private domain for women. Jealousy towards women must be identified and addressed. There's plenty of room in the C-suites and in every other institution for women, as universities and even Rhodes scholarships have had to make room for women, so must all of our cultural, corporate, and academic institutions. And we must work for the publication of salaries across sectors so that we know how women's work is actually valued. Without that knowledge, we cannot achieve equal pay for equal work because we don't know if we're getting paid equally for equal work, although most of us are told we're getting paid very well, when indeed we're not. When a self-confessed proud sexual harasser can be President of the United States, the more or less steady progress towards equality that I expected when I came up 39 years ago seems really quite naive. But the fact that this gathering of hundreds of Rhodes women can now assemble here is the result of several generations of work that began before any of us was born. I think we all know that progress is hard and takes time and is not linear. But Ralph Waldo Emerson said, he said some good things, and we're going to let that go and just put this over here. And I'm just about done, but this is about, for those of you, the last talk that someone gave about, oh, here we go. Okay, was about small s success. And I'm going to talk about big S success. But Emerson says, you know, to leave the world a bit better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, or a redeemed social condition, to know even one life breathed easier because you lived, this is to have succeeded. Okay, granted, it's hard to fault Emerson. What he says is quite beautiful. It's a lovely sentiment. Okay, but not here, not now, thanks, is what I say. Like Cecil Rhodes, who thought in terms of continents and centuries of posterity, I think that women Rhodes Scholars have tried to operate and will try to operate on a broader scale. I'm going to try this one last time for the last slide. One life breathing easier, it's excellent, and we applaud Emerson for that. But if all of us can make it our focus to have 1,000 lives breathing easier, well, even more so. We are grateful for the opportunity the Rhodes Scholarships gave us, and we want to do all we can to say thanks. The money spent on us women, we know and have shown is an excellent investment, is already paying dividends to the worlds in which we live, to those we touch, and to the institutions and people who touch us. And in the next 40 years, we will do even more. That is for sure. Thank you.